Kristen, and you're listening to Podcast and Amplify, a podcast for women entrepreneurs who want to amplify their voice and brand through podcasting and grow a wildly successful business. I'm the executive producer and host of 2 shows and an entrepreneur, and I love helping women grow their visibility, mindset, and business to the next level. Each week, I share tips on how to launch and leverage your podcast, and I'm bringing on the very best business leaders to give you advice on how to build your business empire. Let's amplify your voice and business. Welcome back to Podcast and Amplify. If you haven't listened to the first episode of this season, episode 70, my interview with Carla Santamaria, she interviewed me actually, and we talked about the changes that are happening this season 3. And one of the things that we talked about is that I'm going to be dialing back the number of podcast tip episodes that I put out. And the reason for that is really just driven by my need to balance my time and put my energies into the things that I think will be the most impactful. I'm really loving these interviews. And while I think the podcasting tip episodes are useful, are valuable, I can't really commit right now to putting them out every week. That's okay. I can always dial it back up next season. But for season 3 of this podcast, you can expect these podcast tip episodes every other week. Now, as always, if there are episode topics that you want to see, email me, DM me. I am more than happy to create a podcast for you just for the topic that you're wanting to hear about when it comes to podcasting. So this episode I wanted to do because if you haven't heard already, I spoke at Podcast Movement, its national conference in Dallas, and it was such a great experience. And so to answer the question, should you attend a podcast conference? The answer is absolutely. And I wanted to just share my 4 reasons for attending a podcast conference, other than the fact that I was speaking at one. So I got to be honest, I was a little bit skeptical about these podcasting conferences. So when I would see pictures from the conferences and how they were promoted, I just felt like, that's not my vibe. And I think part of it was because it felt like a club that I just wasn't a part of, and I didn't really know that I wanted to be a part of it. Back in 2020, I assume I was seeing pictures of conferences from the previous year since we were in a pandemic that year and there were no conferences, but it looked like a lot of white dudes going to a conference and talking to each other. And that is not my vibe. And honestly, I'm kind of averse to anything that feels like a club or a group or that feels a little bit exclusive. And that's kind of how I felt about the podcasting community from the conference standpoint. These are all assumptions. They're all based on things that I saw online and just kind of a gut feeling. So I think a few things have happened. I think that the podcast community within the span of just 3 years has grown tremendously and become way more inclusive and diverse. And so when I applied to the conference in, I believe it was May or April of 2021, I felt like that landscape had changed a bit. And I wasn't wrong. When I went to the conference, there was such an effort made to be inclusive, from speakers to panelists to the type of topics. And I could sense that when I applied that things had shifted. So that's really why I wanted to go to the conference, wanted to apply to be a speaker at the conference. So that's number 1. And these things are not necessarily in order of importance. But since I'm talking about the speaking part, Number one, exposure. So if you can speak at a podcasting conference, that is a huge get. And at least for someone like me who helps people with their podcasts, it's great for, building legitimacy and helping me be seen as like a player in the podcasting world and someone who knows what they're talking about. So, in that sense, it's really great exposure. I had people come up to me after my session, and actually, I met someone who invited me on the spot to be on their podcast because of what I just shared in my session. And then we recorded that podcast the very next day. So it was a really great opportunity from that perspective. The way I found out about the opportunity was through a newsletter called BIPOC Podcast Creators. Now, if you haven't signed up for this newsletter, I encourage you to do so. It's fantastic. They give you podcasting tips, they bring in experts that do webinars. And the last one I attended was fantastic. It was all around sponsorship. There is a small fee of $35, but that $35 from what I got from the webinar, I would gladly pay. It was money well spent. And they tell you about the latest goings on in the podcasting world. They give suggestions of podcasts to listen to. They let you know about job offers within the podcasting space. So it's just really fantastic. And they actually held a session where they reviewed your pitch and gave you feedback. And that was really amazing. And I do think that it's why I was successful in landing that speaking opportunity, because the two women, Maribel and Tangia, are experienced at pitching themselves and getting themselves inside the podcast movement conference and other conferences as well. So that was a really great resource that they provided that I really think benefited me and helped me land that opportunity. So let me quickly go over the three other reasons. Networking, there's so many opportunities to meet people. There's parties, which was not my jam, but there's breakfast time, there's in between sessions, and people are really just looking to talk to other people who love podcasts as much as they do. So it's a great networking opportunity. I met some great people. As an introvert, obviously, it's always about quality over quantity. So I didn't meet a ton of people, but the people I did meet, I absolutely loved. And then the learning, they had some really great sessions, and not all of them are great, and be honest. Some of them are like, oh, okay, who approved this? I'm not sure how this passed through the vetting process. But for the most part, there are some really great panelists, speakers. There's big names there like National Geographic, people from Spotify, from Amazon Music, from NPR. So you really get to learn from like the best of the best. And then finally, community. I mean, you're around a bunch of other people who love podcasts. So it does really feel like, gosh, we have this thing in common, and it's just a fun thing to share. And you get to hang out with all these other fellow podcast geeks. And I say that with great affection. And I mentioned a little bit before about diversity. I felt like the panels, the speakers that were chosen, and the topics were inclusive. And I felt like it was done really well. You know, when you go to a conference and you're like, oh, they chose that token person to check the inclusivity box, or it just feels really forced and it feels disingenuous. And I didn't feel that way at this conference because there's so many different perspectives presented to me that it was like, okay, this is obviously a real part of their goal and their mission and their intent when they're choosing guests and the topics. So I was a little concerned that my topic was maybe a little too soft, but there was also diversity in that. So you had like sort of kind of hardcore selling, what I call bro tactics in terms of growing your podcast. And then you had people like me, and I saw several other sessions very similar to mine, where we were talking about things like building community, engaging with your audience, creating a sense of belonging. So, kind of those things that are not like grow your number of downloads by, doing massive giveaways or doing tons of ads. So, there was just like a mix and an openness to different perspectives and different messages. So I really appreciated that. So I would say if you have a podcast or you're thinking about starting a podcast, you want tips for growing your podcast, you want tips on any aspect of podcasting, really, because there are over 100 sessions, I would say attend a podcast conference. There are several. The ones I know of, Podcast Movement, they have several conferences throughout the year. They do a really good job of putting it on. There's She Podcast, which I would love to go to, but I'm not sure that that's going to be in the cards this year. But there's She Podcasts, and there's a few others. There's one in London. I think it's the biggest conference outside of Podcast Movement, which had over 3,000 attendees. I think it is the biggest conference in the world for podcasting. So if you're thinking about going to a podcast conference, I would definitely recommend it at least once so that you can potentially get some exposure, do some networking, definitely do some learning, and be in community with other podcasters. So that's all I have for you on this topic. Should you attend a podcasting conference, I hope this gave you insight into what my experience was like and what that experience could be like for you. So thank you for listening to this episode. I want to remind you that this month, during Latinx Heritage Month, we have some great interviews with Latinas, and we also have some great sponsors. So make sure you go and check out those interviews, because there you'll get to hear about the sponsors, and all of them are offering Podcast and Amplify listeners special discounts and freebies. So make sure you check those out this month, all month long, and from September 15th to October 15th. And that's all I've got for you today. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Podcast and Amplify. If you love the show, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And the best way to support this show is by sharing, rating, and reviewing the podcast. For those of you who leave a review, you'll get the chance to win a 30-minute strategy session or a mini audit of your existing podcast. Thanks for listening, and remember, your voice and what you have to offer is needed in the world. Until next week, take care.